afternoon. Thank you for coming to the New America Foundation. I'm Peter Bergen, very happy to host this event with Victoria Bruce and Karen Hayes, both of whom are recipients of the one of the most important awards in television journalism, which is a DuPont Columbia Award for their film about Ingrid Betancourt. Victoria is also a previously published author, No Apparent Danger, published in 2001, and a former science writer for NASA. Karen has co-produced a number of other films, Held Hostage in Colombia, American Hardcore, documentaries for PBS, National Geographic Television, the Travel Channel, Discovery, etc. Their book, Hostage Nation, is on sale right now, and is the subject of a starred review in Publishers Weekly, which is about as good as it gets in terms of advance publicity. Because we have C-SPAN here, if you ask questions when we get to the Q&A period, please identify yourselves and understand that the questions may need to be repeated by our two presenters, just so the C-SPAN audience can understand those questions. Thanks very much.
Hi, thank you very much to the New America Foundation for having us here. I'd like to start out by telling you a little bit about how we began to do this book. The story started in 2002 when Victoria Bruce had met Ingrid Betancourt, who was running for president of Colombia at that time. And they had met each other in the United States. They were both on book tour with their books, and their publicist, they had the same publicist, and the publicist introduced them. And so she decided that doing a documentary on a presidential candidate who was running for president in Colombia, a woman running for president in Latin America, would be a very interesting story, and especially the story of Ingrid Betancourt. Well, that quickly changed with the kidnapping of Ingrid Betancourt, and we ended up turning and doing a documentary about her family and her campaign, running the campaign in her absence, and about hostages in Colombia and that situation. And from that documentary, we met a person, he was a Colombian journalist named Jorge Botero, and we were introduced to him by our camera person. And at that time, we interviewed him, and we also did some filming with him with Ingrid's husband at the time, and Jorge Botero, because Jorge Botero had been covering the conflict in Colombia for about 20 years, I'd say. And he was had been one of the only journalists to get into hostage camps, and his reporting on that for Colombian television and newspaper reporting was something that was very instrumental in the 90s when President Pastrana ended up doing a hostage exchange between the guerrillas and the government. He was exchanging military and political prisoners in Colombia for guerrillas who were in Colombia's prisons. So we met Jorge Botero and we interviewed him. And then a year later, in 2003, three American contractors, well actually 4 American contractors who were in a plane that went down. And when their plane crashed, we immediately started getting in touch with the mother of one of the American hostages because she was the only person who was on TV. And at that point, about 3 or 4 months after the hostages had been taken hostage in 2003, Jorge Botero called us out of the blue one day and said, "Can you get an interview with the mother of one of these Americans? I need to have it, and I might not see you for a long time after that, but I'll be in touch." So we did, and we ended up making a film called Held Hostage in Colombia about the American contractors who were held. And he was actually able to get into the hostage camp and do an interview with the hostages in captivity. And from that point, Victoria and I began to think that a book on this subject would be a great way to tell the whole story, because time had gone by and we weren't able to film everything that we wanted to include. So we began writing a proposal, and then as the years were going by, we never quite could get the proposal finished to a point that our agent said was okay. So it was finally in 2008 when we had something ready, and by that time we had gotten back in contact with Jorge Botero and started working with him to work on this book and get it to the place that it is now. And 2 months after we had submitted our proposal, the American hostages were rescued. So that took the book in somewhat of a different turn, and I'll let Victoria tell you more about the process of that.
Hi. I'd also like to thank Peter Bergen and the New America Foundation for having us, and I'd like to say hi, Mom and Dad, who are in the audience. They've surprised me. I didn't know you were in town. They're from California. Did you know about this? They always do this. As Karen was saying, the story began about the hostages. It began first Ingrid Betancourt and then the 3 Americans. And the reason that we believed that the situation with the Americans would be imperative to tell to a U.S. audience was because we didn't see anything happening on that case. I mean, this is about the time when Jessica Lynch was captured in Iraq, and that was a huge story, and there were people rallying around her. And over the course of time, you've seen a lot of cases where there have been Americans held hostage, and Jimmy Carter's on a plane, and people are doing something. And in this case, nothing was being done. And we'd followed the story from the beginning, and we were, convinced that the story had to be told. So we'd followed it. But at the same time, and many of you here work in Latin American issues, it's very hard to get a U.S. media audience excited about Colombia. How do you tell a story like that? So the story we became aware in about 2006 when Simon Trinidad, a guerrilla who was captured, and he was accused of being part of the hostage taking of the 3 Americans. He was sort of a mid-level commander, higher than mid-level, and he was brought to the U.S. He was captured and brought to the U.S. and charged with conspiracy to commit hostage taking. And who came to be part of that trial but our former colleague Jorge Enrique Botero. And at this point we realized that Karen and I had been working on this case, and we had an FBI agent as a character and a State Department prosecutor, and we were sort of weaving the story together. But what we were missing was the real in-depth side of the FARC, and who better to bring that into our story than Jorge Enrique. And so it was during that time that we decided to write this book together. And what happened from then on out is what we really realized was that it was a much bigger picture than a hostage story, and that telling the story of the FARC and America's relationship with the FARC and telling it through characters, one who is a banker who tried to come to the political arena with the Unión Patriótica, which was part of groups of guerrillas and left-wing organizations that tried to be part of the Colombian political process and failed miserably when many, many of their members were assassinated. Simon Trinidad was part of that, and he became a guerrilla. So it's a fascinating story. Why leave your cushy life as a banker? Your wife has a jewelry store, and he becomes part of that. On the other side, here in the U.S., there was a former FBI agent who's another character, Gary Nessner, and he was trying to work the case from the side of the U.S. And he had spent his life in the FBI honing his skills of negotiation, and he had actually become the chief head of crisis hostage, what is his title? Hostage negotiator. It has another title, but he had perfected this. So the FBI, after Waco, Gary was responsible for getting 35 people out alive. They took him out of there, and the tactical people went in and sort of overran the negotiators, and the rest is, sad history for the FBI. But Gary Nessner had left the FBI, and he was on the case for these 3 Americans. And what he found was that at the time, post 9/11, there was absolutely no desire by anyone in the government to negotiate. And this infuriated him. So our book tells his story going forward and trying to push to get the guys out. At the same time, there's a prosecutor, Ken Cole, who's bound and determined to convict this Colombian guerrilla for kidnapping the American hostages. So we also realized that none of this would be in play without something that our country's been doing for 40 years, which is fighting a war against an herb, the cocaine plant, and spending billions and billions of dollars militarily to fight drugs. That's been our relationship with Colombia. And so to explore that, we wanted to tell a fascinating story. So we have all these characters, but at the same time show how the U.S. has really failed miserably, caused there's so much violence that has come out of this, and we continue down the same path. So that became a really important part of the book and why we wrote it. Thanks.
Thank you Thank you, Victoria and Karen, very much. Gary Nosner, who's played a critical role in your book, has a new book himself coming out called Stalling for Time, which is a history of his life as a hostage negotiator. But it's not that, I wanted you to perhaps comment on the fact that because of the way that anti-terrorism laws are written in this country, the 3 Americans who were taken were working for Northrop Grumman. For Northrop Grumman to do a deal that in some way gave money for exchange for hostages, which is often the only way you can get people out, effectively would have been illegal. Is that right? I mean, if you could comment a little bit about it, because the money would be going to a terrorist organization, in this case, the FARC.
Right. I would say what happened in the past, I'd say this started post-Waco, no, was it before Waco, where the FBI had been placed on any case of an American being held hostage anywhere in the world. There'd be two full-time negotiators. And what they would do is if someone got kidnapped from a corporation or a company and the family wanted to pay, the FBI would work hand in hand with them. And the stance of the federal government has always been, we won't pay ransoms. So the money won't come from the federal government, but they did condone behind the scenes negotiating by FBI agents, always. And many, many ransoms have been paid from many, many companies. But that did change in this case, although there are other cases with the journalist from the Christian Science Monitor where she got out and we sort of believe that money was exchanged. We don't know if that was the newspaper paying for it or family, but in this case, the State Department was adamant that the FBI completely stay out of it. They didn't want them with the families. They didn't want them negotiating. They didn't want to give them really any chance to pay that money. And when Northrop actually went to send medicine and a care package and letters from the family, the government actually stopped them from doing that and said, if you do this, you're supporting terrorism and you're offering military support to terrorism. So Northrop kept going back and forth, aided by Nosner, over the years saying, let us do something. And really, up until the very end, they were not letting them do anything.
Another question which this case raises is the question about what should the family do when somebody's kidnapped? Because obviously there's basically 2 approaches. There's you mentioned the journalist in Baghdad who was working for the Christian Science Monitor. Her family was very vocal about the fact that she'd been taken. When David Rode was kidnapped, not only was the New York Times reporter, there was essentially a news blackout on that, which all news organizations basically agreed that they wouldn't. So you either have the choice of being public or saying nothing because you don't want to amp up the demands of the hostage takers that they think they've got somebody very important. Now, can you explain what the families in this case did and how their feelings about whether or not to stay silent over time changed?
In this case, as soon as their plane crashed and they became hostages, the U.S. government told the families, the State Department told the families that we don't want you to talk about this. Don't talk to the media. And one of the mothers refused to follow those guidelines. That's Jo Rosano. She's a mother of Mark Gonzalez. She immediately went to, I believe it was MSNBC, and there was an article that they had published about the crash. There was very little media about the crash when it actually happened. And she went and she began talking publicly about it. Now, the rest of the families were afraid because they didn't want to put their loved ones' fates in danger. They didn't know what to do. These are average, everyday people, and a family member gets kidnapped, and the idea of trusting your government is something that they were going along with and they felt they should do. So it had been probably 5.5 months, and when we went to make the film Held Hostage in Colombia, we started going around to the family members and trying to locate them and show them pieces of the video footage that we had of their husbands giving them a message. And so we went to the wife of Mark Gonzalez at that time, and we basically went up to her doorstep and knocked on her door at about 8 o'clock at night because we had tried calling other family members and that didn't really work. So we went there, and she sort of peeked out her door and looked out and finally opened the door, and we told her who we were and that we had these messages for her. And she said, after we talked to her for about 3 hours, she said, I have not talked to any media. She said, but I'm so furious about what's going on because there's really been no message about what's happening to my husband, what's going on, what's moving forward. And so she finally decided to talk to media. And slowly throughout the years, they were kidnapped for 5.5 years. Some of the other family members did start coming out and talking to the media because they felt like this is going on for so long. At this point, what's it going to hurt? But from the U.S. government's perspective, when I talked to someone directly in the State Department, they had told me, yes, our plan is to tell the family members not to talk about it, don't talk to the media, because we're worried that their value could increase and that it could become a more challenging situation. So in essence, there's two very opposite approaches, and there's really no final solution about which one is the right one to go. I think it's very situation dependent.
Was part of the calculation on the government's part that since these guys were working for Northrop Grumman and effectively were, I guess, CIA subcontractors or involved in Plan Colombia in some shape or fashion, that also would, clearly whoever they were working for, they were working directly against the interests of the FARC, right? They were involved in some way in drug eradication.
Yes, with the gentlemen who were kidnapped, they were contractors for Northrop Grumman, and they did work DOD contracts, State Department contracts. The State Department really runs the show down there as far as fumigation. They're the ones who hire Northrop. They hire Lockheed Martin. They give the money. It's in the State Department's budget. It's really not a military operation, which is kind of what got the guys in hot water when they first crashed. And what they were doing was reconnaissance. The FARC, the guerrillas that have been in Colombia for 45 years, sort of fell into the drug trade. They were surrounding all of the rural areas where there's really not much state presence, there's no government, and that's kind of where they held camp, and they made money off extortions, kidnappings. They weren't really into the drug trade at that point. But later on, when the U.S. made an attack on Pablo Escobar, the cartel heads, and really thought that they would put a nail in the coffin of the drug war by doing that, it diversified the trade, and the guerrillas just swooped in and now have a big chunk of it. The other main players in Colombia are the paramilitaries. But Plan Colombia, the U.S. effort in Colombia, which is half a billion a year on average over 10 years, is a way for us to sort of play a part in the drug war from here militarily by doing two things. One is trying to help the Colombians fight the FARC, even though they're only one of the players in the drug war, and not even probably a significant percentage, a significant percentage, but not more than 50%. And then the other method is what we do to defoliate. We spray toxic herbicide on the countryside. This is something like Roundup that you'd buy at Home Depot. We put it in airplanes. These are American products, American airplanes, American companies doing this work, and the government has let us in. The government of Colombia has agreed to let us do that. And this is basically what the contractors were doing at the time.
William Wood, who was the American ambassador in Colombia, then moved to Afghanistan. And of course, he was very much in favor of aerial spraying in Afghanistan. The Afghan government said no. Are there any lessons to be learned for Afghanistan from Plan Colombia, and particularly in the light of the fact that the Taliban is, just like the FARC, an ideological movement that has also become a criminal enterprise to a large degree? Or are the situations so different that there's no kind of way of saying that lessons learned from Colombia could be implemented in Afghanistan? Certainly William Wood thought there could be ways to implement lessons.
In terms of the correlation between Afghanistan and Colombia, I actually see a lot of similarities in the countries, in the sense of the geography of both countries is so extreme that there's parts of the country that are actually have no central government. Well, in Afghanistan, that's a different situation with the tribal organization. But parts of the country are so difficult to access. In Colombia, a lot of the area where the FARC guerrillas are is jungle. There's no roads into the area. There's boats. But in Colombia, it's devoid of state presence in those areas, and so the FARC guerrillas can become the rule of law. And I think that in Afghanistan there's a correlation with that, and that drugs are grown easily in Afghanistan as they are in Colombia. So there's a lot of similarities, and whether similar things can be applied, I think we should take a look at what's actually happened over the 4 decades of this drug war and what real success has really come of it. Because even though the government organizations can present numbers and say, oh, we're having so much success. This year the coca growing in Colombia is down. Well, if you look at the whole context of the picture, it's actually the coca growing is up in Peru. So it's just sort of passing the buck to another country and, looking at it in a very small view to say this is a success. But if we look at it, why has this been going on for so many decades and so many billions of dollars and so many lives lost in the process? And I think that's something to really keep in mind when we're looking at Afghanistan.
I have to say I agree with Karen. I mean, the fact that William Wood could say we should apply this 10 years of failure to go fail some more for 10 years is ridiculous. I mean, there's absolutely no signs of success that what we've done in Colombia has helped stop the flow of drugs to the U.S. on any level.
Just one final question before I throw it open. I mean, it seems that, the FARC, if you could give us an assessment, have sort of basically suffered a self-inflicted defeat to some degree. Plan Colombia was not just about the drugs, it was also about rolling back the insurgencies in Colombia. When I say insurgencies, multiple insurgencies, right? So clearly the violence has subsided. So was Plan Colombia a success in terms of making Colombia essentially safer, even if the drug problem is not really, that was less of a success? And one other kind of sub-question here is, the real mark of success of an anti-drug program in places like Colombia would be a rising street prices in the United States. And my impression is that prices have either remained stable or actually gone down. So your point, Karen, is like if we seem to have just moved the problem somewhere else, the problem hasn't gone away. If you could just perhaps talk about that.
In terms of the Plan Colombia, whether it's been a success in Colombia in any way, what really happened is you had mentioned that Colombia seems like it's a safer place than it was, let's say, during the days of Pablo Escobar. And with President Uribe, he came in with a very strong military approach to the guerrillas, and primarily, I'd say, focused on the guerrillas, although there was a large demobilization plan for the paramilitaries, which turned out to be not quite as successful as it was touted. But what happened was, it's true that in Colombia there are certain areas that have become safer. Roads that people could not travel on prior are able to be traveled on by car. And things like that, the military has made an effort to go retake some areas that were run by the FARC. But still recently, even as recently as this past month, the FARC have started up again with brazen attacks on police convoys, on electrical towers, on things like that. So for a while, there was sort of a calm, and people were saying, "Oh, the FARC, they're nearly defeated." But I believe that they were just sort of in a holding pattern, and they're coming back with a strong vengeance. I don't know if their numbers have decreased over the years, certainly, but I don't see it as we've won the war against the FARC or whatever President Uribe was attempting to do at that time. I don't see that as a full success as he had hoped.
Yeah, and I would also like to add that a lot more sort of gang violence has come about in the past few years with other players getting into the drug business. So if you take the FARC and you wipe them out of the city, the military can't stay and run the city. There's not money for it. There aren't government programs. So that power vacuum is given up to brutal gangs as well. So in the city, I've been working in Colombia for 10 years, and I can definitely say I love that country, and it feels much safer to be in Bogota or the bigger cities, even smaller cities. But out in the country, I fear that the campesinos and the people that live there are subject to just as much violence from the paramilitaries and the guerrillas and the military as they have been through the years.
Great. We'll throw it open to questions. We've got a mic over here. Just in front of you, thanks. Would identify yourself?
Norman Bailey, Institute of World Politics. Thank you very much for your presentations. A very quick question and also a quick correction. The quick question is, where is Jorge, and why did you refer to him as your former colleague? The correction is that the disastrous, bungled Waco operation was run by the ATF, not by the FBI.
Forgive me, but that was my faux pas. It was run by the ATF. Do I need to repeat the question, Peter, or is it Mike?
Well, so no, I mean, maybe just respond about where Jorge
Jorge,
was.
yeah. I meant when I referred to Jorge as our former colleague, he continues to be our colleague, and we'll be here tomorrow night at an event where we have a Borders at 6:30. So if you could pass that along to Borders here, right?
Washington, D.C., 18th and out.
Right.
Northwest.
And unfortunately, he tried to get here today, and he couldn't get here. But when I said that, we had worked with him earlier with the Ingrid Betancourt film, and he had sort of been a guide to the insides of the workings of hostage camps. He was the only one ever to get inside hostage camps in Colombia. He had made a film that sort of brought that attention to the Colombian population of about 500 soldiers who had been kidnapped for several years. And so when he called us again, I don't think Karen and I ever thought we'd hear from him again. And so he was our former colleague at that time, and now he continues to be our colleague.
Well, that raises a good question. It's hard enough to write a book by yourself, but how do you write a book with 3 people?
Writing a book with 3 people is an interesting process, especially when one of them speaks Spanish almost exclusively and the other one doesn't speak too much Spanish. But what we did is in the prologue of our book, we talk about how we were debating over different ideas for the book, different political viewpoints, different opinions about things throughout the process. But I have to say the book is primarily, Victoria Bruce was really the lead on the book, and it's her voice who carries through the whole book. And then Jorge Enrique Botero was a very important aspect because he gave us a depth of knowledge from all of his years working in the jungles and traveling numerous trips to the hostage camps in the jungle that we could not have ever gotten ourselves. So he became an important point, and he became a character in the book about his whole history and how he came to this point in his life.
Great. In front over here.
Hugh McElrath, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. My question is about hostage-taking, and is it a sort of coldly rational cost-benefit enterprise, or is the FARC, sort of a stupid bureaucracy like our own government? What's the difference in the handling of sort of lower-level hostages, and maybe these Northrop Grumman guys were sort of mid-level, and then, you get a big fish like Ingrid Betancourt?
In terms of the hostage taking in Colombia, it's been something that's been done for years, and for many years it was a ransom-based kidnapping situation, where that was a way that not only the FARC but also the paramilitaries and the cartels would use to capture people they didn't like, get some ransom for them. But then what happened is there was a transformation, and there was a lot of military and national police who are part of the military in Colombia. They were captured in the late 90s, about approximately 400 to 500 individuals in firefights with the guerrillas, and they were taken hostage. And that was a time when the guerrillas decided, we're going to use this opportunity as a political opportunity, and we want to exchange them in return for guerrillas who are in Colombia's jails. And so they did end up having a successful exchange of prisoners. Now, not all of the military and police got out, but a large few hundred got out, and there were still some left there, which they kept and they held on, and they said, we're going to keep hanging on to these top level people. A lot of them were officers in the military, and they hung on to those as their political prisoner. And then Ingrid Betancourt was kidnapped, and there was a process in Colombia that they termed miraculous fishing. And what they would do is if people were coming down a road and there would be a roadblock, they would stop the people and they would look up their worth, maybe on computers or by communications, and then they would take them. And if they were worth a lot, they would keep them. And that was either for ransom or for political. And when Ingrid Betancourt was going on, she was traveling into an area that had formerly been the demilitarized zone of Colombia, and where the FARC had a large presence. And days before, that had broken, and the government was going in to retake the area. And she was going down because a mayor from her political party and mayor of that town was there, and she wanted to go and be with the people because people were calling her and saying, the paramilitaries are coming in, the military's coming in, people are disappearing. So she decided to take a road, and she was kidnapped that way. They found out she was Ingrid Betancourt, and they thought, oh, presidential candidate, this is a great opportunity for us. So, and then with the Americans, that to them, they even referred to it as, these people are falling from the sky for us, like this big pot of gold just landed in their laps, and they put them in the category of the political prisoners as well, or political hostages. So they weren't going to actually necessarily do any exchanges for ransom. They wanted to use them for political leverage.
You mentioned Ingrid Betancourt. She was the subject of a great deal of hostility in the book that was written by the 3 American hostages. Now, obviously, if any of us gets locked up with somebody else for 6 years, you're going to have some strong views about them. But was that merited, or was there kind of, people have very different reactions to her depending on who they are?
Ingrid Betancourt is a very strong character, and so many people do have a lot of differing opinions of her. And Karen and I had met Ingrid before we started the film for 1 hour while she was on book tour for her first book in 2002, right, January. And I had thought, this would be a great way to sort of tell the story of the beauty of Colombia that I had felt when I was there researching my first book, which was about a volcanic disaster, historical. And I said, I really want to tell a modern-day story, and let's follow Ingrid on the campaign trail. So Karen and I were making plans to go down there and cover her. I said, I had no experience making a film. Karen had some, so I called her, and I knew she spoke Spanish well. And so we're on our way down there, and she was kidnapped. So what we ended up doing in the film, The Kidnapping of Ingrid Betancourt, is sort of telling her story through her own narration, which is cut together from various interviews on NPR, on C-SPAN, things that she had done while she was on book tour. So she has a beautiful voice, and she narrates her story in the beginning, so it was a way for us to put her in the film. However, we never really got to know Ingrid ourselves, and the film became about her husband at the time, Juan Carlos Lecomte, who was this sort of motorcycle riding, rock and roll listener who he had met Ingrid 7 years before. He had never voted before he met Ingrid. And so our film really became about him and sort of this love story of trying to get his wife out of captivity. So as the years went by, we kept in touch with Juan Carlos over the years. And then when Ingrid was released, she and Juan Carlos split within 24 hours of that. After that. So, we were sort of heartbroken for him. And at the same time, we never really got to know Ingrid. So when we hear these reports, I guess we had this love affair with this person that we had made this film about, who's fighting for good. And, you always want to make a film that does something and shows some, wonderful part of humanity and people surviving. So I think it was kind of like shocking for us to hear all these negative things being said about her by the other hostages. At the same time, what Peter says is true. I think everyone is in a survival mode, and you can't really judge anyone if you haven't been in that situation. But since Ingrid's been out, we still don't know her very well. And I know she has a book coming out soon, so probably we'll get to know her through that book.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Leon Weintraub, University of Wisconsin, Washington semester in International Affairs. I'd like to ask a question about the operation that freed Ingrid Betancourt. There was I recall a lot of controversy by the ICRC about its neutral symbols being used in a military or a quasi-military operation, therefore distorting its use or destroying its use as a valid kind of neutral symbol. Could you explain that a bit more fully for those of us in the audience?
What happened was on July 2nd, 2008, there was a military operation run by the Colombian military called Operation Jaque. And that operation was a mission to rescue 15 hostages, including Ingrid Betancourt, the 3 Americans, and other Colombian military and national police members. And this operation, you're right about your question in terms of the use of logos, like, for example, the International Red Cross logo. What the Colombian military did was they devised a plan, an intelligence operation, to go in and basically trick the guerrillas into bringing these 2 groups of hostages together and then come and meet at the certain space, and then this this mission that looked like a humanitarian organization. It was a fictitious organization to the point of they created a website for it, they created a logo for it. The intelligence officers took acting classes, they dyed their hair, they did all sorts of things to take on these characters which would represent different members of a humanitarian organization. And the helicopters were actually painted the same exact colors that they had been when President Hugo Chavez had done a mission to pick up hostages that the FARC were releasing to him prior in 2008 and late 2007. So what the Colombian military did is there was a big issue over this use of this one logo, and their mission was called, I believe it was, I don't remember the exact title, but it was Misión Humanitaria International or something like that. And they did come in and they were able to rescue these 15 hostages. We tell about it in the end of the book, but in a way that no shots were fired, and they were actually able to bring on the 2 FARC guerrilla captors of the hostages, get them onto the helicopter as well. And in that sense, there was some backlash about the use of the logo, and would this jeopardize future humanitarian missions? I don't know what the final resolution of that was. I think that there was some sort of play of one of the guys who wore the logo said, "Oh, I just did it last minute," or some sort of not very clear story about what actually happened. But in the larger picture of the mission as a whole, as a rescue mission, it was a very well, barring this logo usage, it was a very well planned out operation, which really resulted in the freedom of 15 people who had been held for longer than 6 years.
One of the worst situations to be in is to be in a rescue situation. I mean, we've seen that repeatedly, particularly with countries that don't have particularly robust hostage rescue Delta Force type. Was there a concern amongst the hostages that they might get rescued by the Colombian army and it would be a bloodbath in which they would die?
Yes, that was a definite worry by all of the hostages because they were constantly surrounded by guerrillas, and all the hostages that we know of, the political hostages, were very aware that the FARC mandate from the leader of the FARC, Manuel Marulanda, at that point, was that if there is a rescue attempt, or even the thought of a rescue attempt, to murder all of the hostages immediately. And that had been done right before, was it right before the Americans were kidnapped? It was after Ingrid had been kidnapped. She had been kidnapped a year by the time the 3 Americans were kidnapped. And there was an attempt to rescue some hostages, and they were all shot. And with a couple survived afterwards. So, anytime, it wasn't just the guerrillas that were freaking out when they heard helicopters coming from the military, it was the hostages too. So at the time that this bogus humanitarian mission comes in, you've got these hostages that are rebelling because the guerrilla commanders have been taking orders from the military. They don't know that, but they'd infiltrated their radio systems, and they're giving commands to this guerrilla who's in charge, and they're saying, move them here, as Karen said. And they said, make them wear white T-shirts that say yes to the humanitarian accord or the humanitarian exchange. And at this point, the hostages said, they thought they were going to be set up for a proof of life. They didn't want to do anything like that. They said, film us as we are. You're treating us like barbaric. We have chains around our neck. Film us like this. So they wouldn't wear these shirts. Well, the Colombian military was hoping that when they came in from the air on these planes, they could easily identify who was a hostage just because they'd be wearing the shirt. Well, they wouldn't wear them. So at the same time, the military is coming down and looking, and the radio transmissions are messing up, and there's no one in these shirts because the hostages are rebelling. So it was like Karen said, impeccably executed because, all of the things that were just about to go wrong didn't. And I think the question was whether, they were worried about being rescued. Absolutely. That was one of their biggest fears.
Over here.
My name is Dennis Grubb, and I'm a member of FOC, Friends of Colombia in Victoria. I can assure you that FOC is a group of returned Peace Corps volunteers, and you as you might know, there were 5,000 Peace Corps volunteers who have served in Colombia over the years. And they had to leave in 1984 because of a kidnapping of volunteers by the FARC. They've recently returned in a small group. However, my question relates to, I have not read your book, okay, I will later. The title, Hostage Nation. My question relates to, you're telling the story of the hostage situation. Do you tell the story of the political outcome, right, of this hostage nation? You know, where do we go from here? We're quite familiar. We've been at this for 50 years, certainly 45 in the drug war. Do you address the issue? Where do we go from here? You know, continue playing Colombia at $500 million a year, or, you know, is there another alternative?
In the book, we do talk a lot about, like you said, the history of Plan Colombia and how we got to this place. One of the things that we begin to talk about is taking it from what's going on with Plan Colombia and looking at now what's going on into Mexico, since so many things are going on in Mexico with the drug issue, and how the U.S. is starting to step their feet into Mexico as they have in Colombia. And I think it's really a way to look at things in a larger context, try and get a whole picture of the situation for the people who are the policymakers and the decision makers to say, let's take a larger view of this and see what have we been doing, what are we about to do, or we've actually by this point already started to do, and how do we need to rethink what some of the options are. A lot of countries in South America and Latin America are beginning the process of decriminalization of small doses of personal use drugs. Like in Mexico, they've done marijuana, cocaine, all sorts of drugs for small doses of that, the decriminalization of it. And other countries are looking at that as ways to bring down some of the violence that's going on, take out some of the mafia aspect of what's happening with these drug wars. And even in the U.S., the talk of legalization or decriminalization in many states is beginning to be brought out, as well as the use of medical marijuana in many states. And I think that that's a very interesting path to travel down, because it's something we're essentially in a state of prohibition. And I think that, you know, when something is illegal like this, and there is such a demand for it in the United States and in Europe, as long as the demand is as strong as it is, I think it's going to continuously, there's not going to be an easy way to solve this. And I think going in and fumigating crops and destroying, fumigating these coca plants, which end up popping back up because they're weeds anyway, but destroying crops in the process, contaminating water, hurting people, that type of thing needs to be looked at it from a totally different aspect.
Hi, my name is Damian Merle. I'm with Ostosol, that's a political consulting firm. Quick question. How helpful was the finding of the Raul Reyes laptop in your research, and how much of a Venezuelan influence that has now been proven by President Chavez have you seen as you conducted your research, wrote your book?
That's an interesting question. Over the 6 or 7 years we worked on this book, there were so many sort of aha moments where we thought, okay, we can finally end this book. And that was, before the hostages were rescued, that made an obvious ending, but there wasn't one. We had been commissioned by Knopf to write this book before the hostages were rescued, and we never really knew where it was going to end. And so the gentleman talked about Raul Reyes, who was one of the members of the 6-member secretariat, of
the FARC.
Of the FARC. He's a guerrilla commander, and he was sort of the public relations commander. And Jorge Enrique Botero had been in contact with many journalists. Anytime anyone was trying to get access, they would go there. And his camp was known to be in the very southern part of Colombia, near the border of Ecuador. It ended up actually being in Ecuador, which was news to the Ecuadorians when the Colombians went in their airspace and bombed Raul Reyes' camp, killing him and a lot of his men and women, many women in the FARC, and I should not discount that. And what happened was the FARC is very technologically savvy. As Karen said, they have satellite computers and phones, and they can look up your bank account, hopefully not your bank account. But they had, and Raul Reyes had a lot of connections, and when they went through the computers that they found in his camp, they found what appeared to be many ties to Hugo Chavez, letters where there was perhaps money going one direction and the other. There were many journalists who were talking to him in ways that they looked very supportive to the FARC. There was a lot of trouble. There were humanitarian workers that were sort of named in Reyes' computer. So there was many, many things that were going on there. Now, Interpol had checked out these computers. I mean, these are according to reports, and I haven't been there, but and said that they hadn't been tampered with. And then recently there was a police investigator who admitted that he had those computers before they went to Interpol, and that he had sort of falsified some of these emails. So now the data is really in question. Whether Hugo Chavez has a relationship with the FARC, he certainly doesn't have one with the Colombian government, as we all know. And so, that to me personally, that's not hard to believe. And, the border from Venezuela to Colombia is obviously very porous. A lot of people say that there are a lot of arms trafficked between there from, through Venezuela to the FARC. So there are those connections.
In front here.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. I actually have two questions. One is, what were the conditions under which the hostages were kept? I mean, what were their lives like for all those years? And the second is, are there no other economic options in Colombia, ways in which people can sort of support themselves other than doing human trafficking, drug trafficking, arms trafficking?
In terms of your first question about how the hostages were kept in Colombia, when we made our film Held Hostage in Colombia, and Jorge Enrique Botero had gone in to interview the Americans, what the Americans said on tape at that time was that they were being treated well, they had coffee to drink, they were wearing clean uniforms, their hair had been cut, etc. And Jorge Enrique Botero came back and he said, well, the one thing they didn't say on camera was that they had not been allowed to talk to each other for the whole 5.5 months of their captivity. They had been separated. They were not allowed to communicate because the guerrillas were paranoid that the Americans, even from the moment of their capture, they made them strip down naked. They were sure there were, little bugs in their clothing or something, that the government was following them. And so they were paranoid that if the men were to talk to each other, they would surely, find a way to alert the military or escape or something. And so we found out that they were not allowed to talk to each other at all for that first time, and they also had no radio communication, which was frequently something that the hostages were allowed to have because there were radio programs in Colombia where loved ones can go and leave messages for the hostages. So that was, and from when Jorge Enrique Botero went in, the FARC had sort of prepared the area where they were going to be, and later we learned in the American hostages book that they wrote when they came out that the conditions were really horrible, in the sense of at a certain point in their captivity they were each put in, sort of locked in these boxes, like 6 by 6 foot, or some sort of boxes to sleep in. They were totally separated. At a certain point later in the captivity, Ingrid Betancourt had tried to escape about 3 times approximately, and after her escapes, they started chaining the hostages. They would chain her to a tree by her neck. They would chain, once the Americans and Ingrid Betancourt and other hostages were all in one camp, they would chain 2 hostages together by their neck, and they had to wear these chains with them and carry them on these long 40-day marches. So what they presented in their video when they were on camera, the hostages said, we're doing fine, we're healthy, we're well taken care of. They really wanted to reassure their families that we're okay, and so that their families didn't worry. And at that point, they didn't have to wear chains. It was early in their captivity, so they weren't in some of the more brutal treatment which happened later. But that was something that they made a point of doing, is trying to calm their families down through the message.
And the second part of that question was, sort of what are the opportunities in Colombia and why are people joining the FARC gangs or militaries? And the bottom line is there are very few, if any, in many of these rural villages. There are no roads. This area was populated, and we tell this story in the book, and it was something I didn't know after my first, I guess until late in the investigation. In the early part of the 20th century, there was a period called La Violencia, which was when there was a war between the two ruling parties in Colombia, the liberals and the conservatives. And estimates go from 100,000 to 300,000 people were killed, and brutal murders constantly. And during that time, many of the sort of poor people who didn't want to be involved in this went into the jungles, and they call this area the Caguan River Basin. And the Caguan eventually feeds the Amazon. So it's very low-lying, it's very jungle terrain. And they sort of came up and made these little villages pop up, and they self-governed for the most part, and things were sort of rolling along nicely. They had a culture that was a combination of all these different cultures from different parts of Colombia, and they had very small farms, slash and burn agriculture, and after a while, what happened was the guerrillas came there too. Not so much as a menacing presence, but they were almost like they started becoming the government and sort of taking care of these areas a little bit. What happened next was that the cartels realized that, wow, we have all of this expanse of land where there's no government that will do anything to stop us. This is where we should be growing all this coca. So they came with seeds, and they came to these poor campesinos with their little plots of land that were making nothing from selling yuca and, papas and, very small things, if they were selling at all. And they said, look, we'll give you these seeds, you grow this plant, you make it with these into base, which is, the first process in making cocaine. We'll come back and get it from you. And so what happened was it was a gold rush. It was a white gold rush, and people, all kinds of sort of, derelicts from the city came and descended into El Caguan, and these villages were overrun by people that had criminal records, and they were escaping from the law themselves, and they were working as raspachinas. Is that the right pronunciation? And they call it raspando, means to scrape, and they take their hands, and these calloused hands, and they scrape the coca leaves all day, and they get paid, I don't know what the pay scale was at the time, but a few dollars a day for this work, but it was a windfall compared to what they were making otherwise. And because of this, there was so much crime in the cities. Now these men would work all week, and at the end they would have gunfights. On the weekend, everyone was drunk, and the FARC started to take over. And that's when the FARC really started sort of ruling this territory in this area. And so the whole area now, when your question was, do people have opportunity? They have opportunity to now be a raspachina and be at the lowest level of the drug trade, or they can be a member of the guerrillas. And there really isn't much else going on at all. Or, joining the paramilitaries, which is the other side and equally as violent.
In back here.
Hi, I'm Daniel Pacheco, El Espectador, the Colombian newspaper. Back in Colombia, Jorge Enrique Botero's professionalism as a journalist sometimes comes into question because he has sympathies which are very similar to FARC's ideology, and he has friendship with Colombian politicians, opposition politicians. How did this internal Colombian politics play into your book and your investigation? Thanks.
That's an interesting question about how internal Colombian politics played into our book. That was something that I feel like in many instances we were working with Jorge Enrique Botero on very specific things about what's going on inside the FARC guerrillas, of his long history of knowledge of this. And as he becomes a character in the book, we actually found out some things about his background and how did he actually have access into these FARC guerrilla camps, because many journalists either don't want to or cannot get the access. And it's true, in Colombia, there's been controversy over him as a journalist because I think it's a difficult situation when somebody, and he's not the only journalist, but when journalists are covering, whether it be the FARC or the paramilitaries, and if they're covering that area very intensely, I think the rest of the population and even the government can begin to question, well, why is this person covering this so intently? Do they have ties, etc.? But what we found out in our research and talking with him was that back in the 1970s, it was at the time of student movements throughout Latin America, and it was in the early mid-70s, and he was really involved in the student youth movement as well. Sort of this revolutionary spirit was going on throughout Latin America, and a lot of people who he was associating with in college ended up going to the route of the guerrillas. So he told us, 5 years into making the book, we were talking to him one night, and we said something about, well, you got an interview with Alfonso Cano, who was a high-level guerrilla member and who's now the leader of the guerrillas. In 1987, the guerrillas had not given any kind of public interviews or anything for many years. And in 1987, Jorge Enrique Botero was able to get an interview with Alfonso Cano. And we said, well, how in the world would you get that interview? And then he revealed to us that in college, he had actually played poker with Cano. He said there was a group of about 5 people who were sort of in these student movements, and they had been hanging out together. And he said, what happened was I went the route of journalism, 2 of these people went the route of guerrillas, and the other 2 people became lawyers. And he said, but at that time in our youth, we were sort of all in this spirit of student movements and fighting for revolution and things like that. And so his history of having known these people 20 years prior was something that later he could sort of draw on to do that. But in terms of your specific question about how internal politics focused in our book, I don't know, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I would like to add on to that because as Peter asked us, it is difficult to write with 3 people with different ideals and different knowledge bases. But one of the things that our review in Publishers Weekly was very kind and said that this was one of the most balanced accounts of the situation between Colombia and the U.S. in the last decade. And, it is true that Jorge Enrique, his journalism oftentimes has been thought to be very much sort of left-leaning and sympathetic to the FARC. And when he's told that, he says, part of that, I think, from working with him over these years, is that the FARC is just one of the players with the same brutality. And yet, if you look at a lot of the media coming out of Colombia, it's only the FARC, where the paramilitaries are actually equally as bad, and most recently in the past few years have been very much connected to the government of Colombia. And so, he really wanted us to avoid just being that, sort of cliche, the one bad player in Colombia is the FARC. And the other thing that, we really appreciated was that he really made us avoid the term or the prefix narco. When we were talking about terrorists, when we were talking about guerrillas, we sort of love labels in this country, and as soon as you label someone a narco-guerrilla or narco-terrorist, it makes it even worse. It makes us able to prosecute Colombian nationals here because we are saying they're drug dealers if they're just like guerrillas. I mean, Simon Trinidad never was convicted for being part of the narco business. They had nothing on him. But in Colombia, so many levels of society are permeated by drug money. He said, if you're going to call these guys the narco guerrillas, you're going to have to say the narco banker, the narco president, the narco this, the narco that, and I think that, that's sort of been the case in Mexico right now. You can see that, these police are being fired, military are being fired, because when you have that much money, because we have this illegal substance that's really worth nothing, that we've escalated to the point where it's worth more than gold, everyone's going to get a piece of the action. And then the players that stay out of it are either killed, or the people who are trying to prosecute are either killed. So we stayed away from just sort of pinning the blame on one group.
In back here, this will be, I think, our last question.
Marie Steinrücke from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and my question kind of pertains to the American government's involvement in this whole situation. And obviously, the American government is really concerned about, drug war and is spending a lot of money in military assistance. My question kind of pertains to, what if that money was spent on development aid to increase opportunities for people in rural areas, so that they could actually do, a legitimate job and wouldn't have to, make their living this way.
I think that's an interesting question about whether the drug money the money we're spending to fight drugs in Colombia would be spent on development aid, and that is something there have been a number of groups who have put money and who have tried to work with development projects, new alternative crop projects, etc. But I think a grander thing to look at in Colombia is the process of the drugs. It's not only Colombia's problem, it's also the United States' problem, it's Europe's problem because of this demand. So that's one issue to look at. The other thing is just the inequity in the society there and the geography of the country, and how the opportunities for a lot of people, maybe development crops would help in some areas, but I think there's some underlying social problems and economic issues that really need to be looked at by the Colombian government and addressed by them in that way. I don't think that I don't believe that there can be sort of an overarching, Band-Aid fix that can go over the population and sort of make everything all right. I think that it has to be approached from a number of different areas, and not only Colombia by itself, but the United States looking at itself inward, and why are we having all these such a demand for this drug, and what's going on here, and how is that influencing it?
One quick question about, you mentioned inequities. I mean, it seems that Colombia is one of the most class-ridden societies in the world, and the political class is essentially a hereditary class. And here you've got the FARC, which is one of the longest, I think probably the longest running Marxist insurgency. To what extent was kidnapping Betancourt a sort of like how did the class thing influence this whole dynamic between the kidnappers and her? And was there ever a deal that, if she hadn't been rescued, and if the Americans hadn't been rescued, was there ever a deal that was plausible for them being released, or was never going to be a deal?
There was a lot of speculation on sort of what was going on behind the scenes with Ingrid, with the French government, who was very active in trying to get her released, with Canadians were involved, and Ingrid's parents were very vocal. Unlike the parents of the Americans, Ingrid's parents, she was already a public figure, and they went everywhere to try to get someone to agree to a negotiation. They also did not want to see Ingrid rescued because they thought that it was too dangerous, and many of the families did not want to rescue. At the time, Álvaro Uribe, the president, was saying, the only thing we're going to do is a rescue. We're not talking to the FARC on this case. And so because Ingrid's family had a lot of political pull in France and in Colombia, they were able to get a lot of meetings. However, in the end, Álvaro Uribe really put a stop to any kind of sort of one-on-one negotiation. He would say, okay, I'll negotiate, but, and the FARC would say, and I'm not blaming Uribe, the other side was just as bad. The FARC would say, we want basically half the country to be demobilized before we'll even talk to you, and so it was really ridiculous. The posturing going back and forth never got anyone anywhere. So that, Ingrid being of a higher class, that in some cases that may have meant that some people thought that she would be the very last one that they would release, because she was the only one that was getting them any press. I mean, the American public didn't care there were 3 Americans, and the Colombians are sort of so used to this kind of kidnapping, they live with it daily, that there's not constant outrage. The families do march, and they do a lot of events, but I don't think that really helped her in the end. It probably hurt her more than anything.
Great. Well, thank you very much to Victoria Bruce and Karen Hayes. Their book is Hostage Nation, a great book, and let's give them a round of applause.